Chapter 1. The Call That Changes Everything. The rain lashed against the windows of Scotland Yard as Inspector Harold Fletcher reached for the ringing telephone. The voice on the other end trembled with urgency. "This is Richard Langley," the caller announced. "There's been a murder at Winslow Manor. Arthur Winslow is dead." Fletcher straightened. "A murder, you say? When did this happen?" I don't know. I just found him," Langley stammered. "You must send someone immediately." By the time the call ended, the inspector was already reaching for his coat. But one detail gnawed at him. The caller had not sounded panicked. Rather, he had sounded prepared. An hour later, as the police car sped through the rain-soaked streets, another figure sat silently in the back seat. Hercule Poirot, his small frame impeccably dressed despite the weather, listened as Fletcher recounted the details. "You find something strange about the call, Inspector?" Poirot murmured. Fletcher hesitated. The way he spoke, he knew too much. Poirot nodded. "A man who discovers a murder reacts with shock. A man who expects a murder, he calls the police first." As the car turned onto the gravel driveway of Winslow Manor, Poirot steepled his fingers. The game had begun. Winslow Manor loomed in the darkness, its grand facade gleaming wet from the storm. The butler, an elderly man with haunted eyes, opened the door before the police had even knocked. "This way, sirs," he said, leading them down a long corridor lined with ancestral portraits, their painted eyes watching in eerie silence. The study was richly furnished, mahogany shelves stacked with leather-bound books, a grand oak desk, and a fireplace where embers still glowed faintly. But it was the figure slumped in the armchair that drew all eyes. Arthur Winslow, business magnate and financier, sat motionless, his body slightly twisted, head lolled to the side. A single gunshot wound to the chest had ended his life. Blood had darkened his silk waistcoat, but there was no gun in sight. Inspector Fletcher frowned. "If this was a suicide, where's the weapon?" Poirot moved closer. The storm rattled the windows as he took in the scene without touching a thing. Winslow's gold pocket watch was missing, an odd theft if robbery had been the motive. On the desk, a half-smoked cigarette rested in an ashtray, though Winslow had never been known to smoke. And in the dead man's hand, a torn telegram, its ink smudged but legible enough to read, "Urgent. You are in danger." Poirot exhaled. This was no ordinary murder. This was a carefully constructed puzzle. Richard Langley stood near the study door, hands clasped, his posture rigid. He was a man in his mid-30s, immaculately dressed, his expression carefully measured. "I found him like this," Langley said, as Poirot studied him. He was already gone. Poirot's eyes flickered toward Langley's cuffs, immaculate, no signs of blood, no visible tremors in his hands. No darting glances of guilt. Calm. Too calm. "You say you merely found him," Poirot murmured. "Yet you called the police before verifying if he was alive." Langley hesitated for the first time. I just knew," he said. "Something in the air. I felt it." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Felt it?" "I can't explain," Langley admitted. "But I heard a strange noise before I entered. Like someone leaving the room." "Did you see anyone?" Fletcher pressed. Langley shook his head. "Number. But there was a faint smell of gunpowder." Poirot considered this. Gunpowder, but no gun. A noise heard, but no fleeing figure seen. The contradictions nested within contradictions. He smiled politely. "Merci, Monsieur Langley. I believe you have told us everything, except the truth." Poirot turned his attention back to the study. Every object told a story. It was simply a matter of reading it correctly. He knelt near Winslow's chair. The wound was clean. A single shot, precise. Too precise for an amateur. His gaze moved to the open safe behind the desk. Empty, not forced open, not ransacked. Someone had taken something deliberately. He examined the half-smoked cigarette in the ashtray. Winslow had been a meticulous man. No vices, no indulgences. he would not have left a cigarette burning in his study. "Inspector," Poirot called. "Was Winslow a smoker?" Fletcher frowned. He despised the habit. Poirot tapped the edge of the ashtray. "Then whose cigarette is this?" Silence. Then the butler cleared his throat. "Sir Charles Denning, his business partner, smokes that brand." "Ah." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And when was the last time Sir Charles was here?" "Yesterday evening," the butler admitted. Poirot filed that away. Then his attention returned to the telegram in Winslow's hand. The paper was torn, as if someone had tried to destroy it in haste. He lifted it delicately, reading aloud. "Urgent. You are in danger." Poirot turned the scrap over. The bottom half was missing. Someone had deliberately removed the sender's name. A chill settled in the room. The killer had left no obvious traces, but they had left enough for Hercule Poirot. Inspector Fletcher addressed the assembled household staff and guests in the drawing room. "Did anyone hear the gunshot?" The butler, Mr. Harris, shook his head. "Not a sound, sir. I was in the kitchen, and I assure you, a gunshot would have carried." Winslow's widow, Eleanor, sitting stiffly on the settee, added, "I was in my room. If there had been a shot, I would have heard it. But there was nothing." Sir Charles Denning, Winslow's business partner, frowned. "I was in the library. I heard a noise, like a chair scraping, but no shot." Poirot, standing near the fireplace, tapped a finger against his chin. "Curious, is it not? A man is shot, yet no one hears the gunfire. Either the walls of this house are thick as a fortress." He turned to the inspector. "Or the murder was committed differently than it appears." Fletcher muttered. "A silencer, perhaps?" "Perhaps," Poirot mused. "Or perhaps there was no shot at all." His gaze flickered toward the study. The body, the wound, the missing gun. Was it all a deception? The room, filled with uncertainty, waited for his verdict. Poirot, however, said nothing further. Not yet. Poirot returned to Winslow's study, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The safe stood ajar, its contents removed, but with great care. No signs of forced entry. Fletcher knelt beside it. If this was a burglary, the thief left in quite an orderly fashion. "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "A safe is emptied, yet nothing appears stolen. A strange robbery, would you not say?" Richard Langley, shifting uneasily by the desk, cleared his throat. "Mr. Winslow kept financial records in that safe, bank statements, investments." "Yet nothing remains," Poirot said smoothly. "Tell me, Monsieur Langley, do you know what should be here?" Langley hesitated. I don't know. Mr. Winslow was private about his business dealings." Poirot lifted an eyebrow. "And yet you are his assistant." Langley looked away. Fletcher exhaled sharply. "So we've got a man murdered, a missing financial record, and a silent gun. Nothing adds up." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "On the contrary, mon ami, it all adds up beautifully, if one knows how to read it." The detective's eyes lingered on the safe, on the papers scattered nearby. A piece was missing from this puzzle. He just had to find it. Richard Langley stood apart from the others, arms crossed, watching Poirot warily. "Tell me, Monsieur Langley," Poirot said, tilting his head. "When you called the police, you told them Mr. Winslow had been murdered. How did you know?" Langley hesitated. I saw the blood. I knew he was dead." Poirot's gaze didn't waver. "Yet you did not check his pulse. You did not call for help. You assumed immediately that it was murder." Langley swallowed hard. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot smiled gently. "I suggest nothing. I only observe." Langley's hands twitched at his sides. "I had nothing to do with it." "Ah." Poirot nodded, stepping away. "You see, Inspector, when a man is innocent, he says, 'I did not do it.' But when a man fears suspicion, he says, 'I had nothing to do with it.'" Langley said nothing, but Poirot had already decided there was more to Langley's story than met the eye. Poirot stepped outside, the storm having subsided into a fine mist. As he adjusted his coat, something brushed against his fingers, a folded scrap of paper tucked discreetly into his pocket. Frowning, he unfolded it. The ink was hurried, smudged, but the message was clear. "You are looking in the wrong place." Poirot's brow furrowed. Who had slipped him this note, and why? Fletcher stepped up beside him. "Something wrong?" Poirot folded the note neatly. "Ah, mon ami, it seems our killer has a sense of humor." Fletcher frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot looked back at the dimly lit house, at the faces within, each hiding their own secrets. The killer was watching them, perhaps even among them. Smiling to himself, Poirot placed the note in his pocket. "Let us continue, Inspector. The game has only just begun." Chapter 2. The Alibi That's Too Perfect. Inspector Fletcher frowned at his notebook, reading aloud the testimony of the two household staff members. "You both confirm that Richard Langley was in the study with you when he made the call?" The maid, a timid woman in her 30s, nodded. "Yes, Inspector. We were all together when he rang Scotland Yard." Poirot leaned forward. "And what were you doing at this time, mademoiselle?" The maid hesitated. "We were tidying up the study. Mr. Langley was pacing, muttering about how Mr. Winslow was late for his usual nightcap." Langley sighed. "I had a feeling something was wrong, and when I found him—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I did what anyone would do." Poirot studied him carefully. "Curious, is it not? You anticipated something dreadful before you had even seen the body." Langley's jaw tightened. "I've worked for Mr. Winslow for years. I knew his habits. I knew when something wasn't right." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Ah, yes, but knowledge and anticipation are different things. You claim you knew, and yet you had no reason to, unless, of course, you did." Langley's gaze flickered, just for a moment. But Poirot caught it. A perfect alibi indeed. Perhaps too perfect. Poirot turned his attention to the three key suspects gathered in the drawing room. Eleanor Winslow, the grieving widow; Charles Denning, Winslow's longtime business partner; and Henry Winslow, the estranged nephew. He began with Eleanor. "Madam Winslow, your husband was killed in his own home. Did you not hear anything unusual that night?" She smoothed the lace on her cuff. "No, I was asleep." Poirot's gaze flickered to a faint stain on her sleeve. "Strange, then, that you have traces of ash upon your nightgown." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "I sat by the fireplace before bed. That is all." Poirot made a note before turning to Charles Denning. "Monsieur Denning, what was your relationship with Mr. Winslow?" Denning exhaled sharply. "We were business partners. That is all." "That is all?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Yet witnesses report you arguing with him the day before his death." Denning's fingers drummed against his knee. "A disagreement over finances. Nothing more." Poirot nodded and turned to Henry. "And you, Monsieur Winslow? You were estranged from your uncle, were you not?" Henry's face darkened. "He cut me out of his will years ago." "A bitter pill, non?" Poirot mused. "And yet, perhaps not so bitter, given recent developments." Henry's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I mean, mon cher monsieur, that fortune is a fickle thing. And wills, they can change." Poirot sat at Winslow's desk, his fingers tracing the edges of the open appointment book. The entries were neat, precise, except for one. "Ah," he murmured. "Fascinating." Fletcher peered over his shoulder. "What is it?" Poirot tapped a particular entry. "A meeting, scheduled for 11 o'clock, the exact time of Winslow's death." "Who was he meeting?" Fletcher asked. Poirot's lips curved into a knowing smile. "That is the question, mon ami. The name is missing." Fletcher swore under his breath. "Someone tore it out." Poirot shook his head. "Non. The ink is smudged, as if written hastily. Whoever Winslow was meeting, He did not expect to write their name down. Denning, from across the room, scoffed. What does that prove? People schedule things all the time. Poirot turned the page, revealing that all subsequent entries were blank. Ah, but here, Monsieur Denning, we see something rather telling. Mr. Winslow had plans for the week, business meetings, appointments, yet after 11 o'clock, nothing. Henry frowned. So? Poirot glanced up. So, mon cher monsieur, it means this. Winslow knew, on some level, that there would be no tomorrow. A silence fell over the room. Someone had arranged this meeting, and that someone had made certain Winslow never left it alive. Poirot turned his attention to the documents the inspector had gathered. Among them was Winslow's will, dated only 2 weeks before his death. Ah, he murmured. Most interesting. Eleanor stiffened. What is it? Poirot's sharp gaze met hers. It appears Mr. Winslow made amendments, quite significant ones. Denning folded his arms. He was always updating his will. That doesn't prove anything. Poirot lifted a hand. Non, it does not prove, but it does suggest. For instance, one of the beneficiaries is no longer listed. All eyes turned to Henry. Henry sat forward, colour draining from his face. You think I killed him because of that? Poirot's voice was calm. I think, Monsieur Winslow, that you were quite unaware of this change. But your uncle, he was aware. Eleanor's grip on the armrest tightened. Then who did he name? Poirot scanned the document, then frowned. A page was missing. Ah, he said softly. This, I fear, is most inconvenient. Fletcher frowned. Someone took it. Poirot nodded. Someone did not wish for us to know who was to inherit. The revelation settled uneasily over the room. The will had been changed, a page stolen, a meeting scheduled for death. And somewhere in that tangled web lay the truth. Poirot moved toward the fireplace, his nostrils twitching ever so slightly. Ah, he murmured, crouching before the hearth. The scent of something burned, but not wood. Fletcher leaned in. What do you mean? Poirot pinched a bit of ash between his fingers and brought it close to his nose. Fabric, he said. A heavy cloth, likely wool. He turned his gaze to Eleanor Winslow, who sat stiffly in her chair. Madame, might I inquire, were you burning something last night? Eleanor's eyes flickered, but her expression remained composed. I often dispose of letters in the fireplace. Poirot nodded. A wise habit, non, but letters do not smell of wool, nor do they leave behind such dark residue. Denning scoffed. What are you suggesting, Poirot? That she burned a cloak to hide evidence? Poirot smiled thinly. Perhaps not a cloak, Monsieur Denning, but something smaller, something stained. His eyes swept over Eleanor's sleeves, noting a faint smudge of soot. The question, madame, he continued, is not what was burned, but why. A silence settled over the room. The fire had concealed something, but what? Poirot straightened. Curious, indeed. And with that, he turned his attention to the desk, where another mystery awaited. Poirot traced a finger along the polished wood of Winslow's desk. Papers lay in neat stacks, except for one obvious absence. Inspector, Poirot said. Monsieur Winslow was meticulous, was he not? Fletcher nodded. To the point of obsession, every financial record was kept in that desk. Poirot opened the bottom drawer. It was empty. Langley shifted uncomfortably. That's where he kept his business ledgers. And yet, Poirot said, one is missing. Denning rubbed his chin. Perhaps Winslow removed it himself. Poirot shook his head. No, Monsieur Denning. Look here. There is dust, except in this precise rectangular space. He tapped the inside of the drawer. The ledger was removed recently. Fletcher scowled. So we've got a missing financial record just before the old man is shot? That's no coincidence. Poirot smiled. No, mon ami. It is intentional. Winslow must have uncovered something, fraud, theft, or a betrayal, and someone wished to ensure he did not act upon it. His gaze flickered to Denning, whose fingers drummed nervously on his knee. "What's the matter, Monsieur Denning?" Poirot asked lightly. "Are business dealings suddenly uncomfortable?" Denning's lips pressed into a thin line. The missing ledger had been no accident. It was a deliberate erasure. But what had it contained? The drawing room had become a stage of unease. Every glance, every motion carried weight. Poirot studied Eleanor again. Her nightgown, despite her previous denial, bore faint stains of ash, a sign of burned evidence. Denning's fingers continued their nervous rhythm against the armrest. The gesture was small, but Poirot did not miss it. A man accustomed to control, suddenly uneasy. And then there was the butler, Harris, who cleared his throat. "If I may, sir." There was something else. Fletcher turned sharply. "What?" Harris hesitated. "Last night, before the storm worsened, I glimpsed a figure near the stables. I thought nothing of it, but now." Poirot tilted his head. "Did you recognize this figure?" "No, sir. It was too dark." Poirot exchanged a glance with Fletcher. Someone had been lurking, watching, perhaps waiting. But for what? The mystery deepened. A constable rushed into the room, his breath short. "Inspector, we found something." Fletcher stood. "Where?" "In the rose garden," the constable said grimly. "A flower pot, buried underneath. It's the murder weapon." Poirot approached as the constable revealed a revolver, wiped clean of fingerprints. Denning exhaled. So it was hidden. Poirot inspected the weapon. "No silencer," he murmured. And yet no one heard a shot. Fletcher frowned. "Then how?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, mon ami, that is precisely the question." The gun had been found, but the true trick of the murder was yet to be revealed. Chapter 3. A Killer Who Knew the Future. Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed on Richard Langley. "Monsieur Langley, you called the police before you even checked if Monsieur Winslow was dead. Pourquoi?" Langley's hands curled into fists. I knew something was wrong. The study door was ajar and the room felt off. I just reacted." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A curious reaction, non? Most men, upon discovering a body, rush forward, check for a pulse, call for help. But you did none of these things." Langley swallowed. "I panicked." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Panicked? Yet you managed to compose yourself enough to call the police immediately. Tell me, Monsieur Langley, were you expecting to find Winslow dead?" Langley's face darkened. "That's absurd." "Perhaps," Poirot mused, "or perhaps you knew more than you have admitted." Inspector Fletcher folded his arms. "You heard no gunshot, and yet you knew it was murder." Langley stiffened. "It was obvious." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "but truth is rarely obvious, mon ami. And yet, you saw it instantly." Langley exhaled sharply, his composure cracking. Poirot had unsettled him. That much was clear. But was it the discomfort of guilt, or of a man caught in a trap not of his own making? The butler, Mr. Harris, cleared his throat. "If I may, sir, something else was odd last night." Poirot turned to him. "Pray, continue, Monsieur Harris." The butler hesitated. "A delivery man arrived close to midnight. I remember because the storm had worsened, and I thought it unusual for a delivery so late." Fletcher frowned. "Who was it?" "That's just it," Harris said. "He came to the door, but never entered. When I answered, he only asked for Mr. Winslow. I told him the master had retired, and he left, without leaving a parcel, without explaining his purpose." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Fascinating. And did you see this man's face?" Harris hesitated. "He wore a cap, pulled low. And the package?" "There was none." Fletcher swore under his breath. "So was there a real delivery, or was this just a way to check if Winslow was alone?" Poirot nodded. "A ghost of a visitor," A conversation without purpose, unless, of course, the purpose was simply to see if the moment was right. And if that were the case, Poirot mused, then Winslow's fate had been sealed before the killer ever entered the room. Poirot examined the torn telegram once more. The ink was smudged, but the words still stood out. Urgent. You are in danger. Fletcher muttered. Who sent it? And why didn't Winslow act on it? Poirot tapped the paper thoughtfully. He did, mon ami. Look at the edges. This was ripped, not torn by accident. The full message has been deliberately concealed. Langley, still tense, scoffed. Concealed by whom? Winslow was clutching it when he died. Precisely, Poirot said, which means someone tried to destroy it but was interrupted. He held the telegram up to the light. Faintly, on the other side, something lingered, barely visible. Poirot reached for a pencil and lightly shaded the surface. Slowly, ghostly letters appeared. Fletcher leaned in. What does it say? Poirot read aloud. Tell Langley. He must not call. Langley blanched. Me? What does this have to do with me? Poirot tapped his chin. It seems, Monsieur Langley, that Winslow, or someone else, wanted to ensure that you did not alert the police. Fletcher's expression darkened. And yet you did. Which means, Poirot finished, that either you ignored the warning, or you knew exactly what you were doing. Langley's hands clenched at his sides. This is ridiculous. Poirot gave him a knowing look. Is it? The silence that followed was deafening. Poirot walked to the window, where a faint outline of muddy footprints trailed beneath the sill. Bending down, his fingers brushed against something cold, a gold cufflink. Carefully, he picked it up and studied the engraving. An intricate crest, not belonging to Winslow. Inspector, Poirot called. Does this belong to our victim? Fletcher took the cufflink, turning it over. Number I'd bet my badge on it. He turned sharply to Denning. Sir Charles, you recognize this? Denning's expression was unreadable. No. Poirot smiled. Ah, but you hesitate, mon ami. Denning exhaled, shoulders stiff. It looks like something I've seen before, but it isn't mine. Poirot tapped the cufflink against his palm. Curious. Then who dropped it here, outside the study window? And more importantly, was it dropped by accident? He lifted his gaze to the room. Or placed deliberately? Langley scoffed. Planted, obviously. Poirot smiled. Then let us ask, by whom? And why? The pieces were falling into place, but the full picture had yet to be revealed. Poirot's gaze settled on the grand oil painting above Winslow's desk, a regal ancestor staring down with a gaze as cold as the grave. He stepped forward, fingertips brushing the frame's edge. Ah, he murmured, how very interesting. With a small movement, he tilted the painting to one side. A hidden safe lay embedded in the wall. Fletcher let out a low whistle. Well, that's new. Poirot smiled. Non, mon ami, it is very old. But what is within? That is new. The inspector retrieved his tools and forced the safe open. Inside, neatly stacked papers gleamed under the dim light. Poirot plucked one from the pile and skimmed the contents. Ah, offshore accounts, he mused. An intricate web of financial deception. And look here, transfers made only days before Winslow's death. Denning's face darkened. I had no knowledge of this. Poirot turned another page. And yet, Monsieur Denning, your name appears here. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Arthur was onto something, wasn't he? Poirot nodded. Mais oui, and someone did not wish him to act upon it. The safe had held secrets, and perhaps the very reason Arthur Winslow had died. Poirot moved back to the desk, his sharp gaze landing on the half-smoked cigarette still resting in the ashtray. Inspector, he said, lifting it delicately, do you recall our earlier conversation? Mr. Winslow did not smoke. Fletcher nodded. Not even a pipe. Poirot twirled the cigarette between his fingers. And yet someone did. And look, this is not just any cigarette. This brand, I believe, is favoured by our dear Monsieur Denning. Denning's expression tightened. You're suggesting I was here? Poirot's eyes twinkled. Suggesting? Non, monsieur, I am stating it. Denning scoffed. Anyone could have left that cigarette. Someone is trying to frame me. Poirot smiled. That is possible, yes. But tell me, if you were being framed, monsieur, why was your cigarette still burning when we arrived? The colour drained from Denning's face. The cigarette had been fresh. Someone had been in that room only moments before Winslow was found. Eleanor Winslow, who had been silent, suddenly straightened. She hesitated, then exhaled. I may have been mistaken in my earlier statement. Poirot turned his attention to her. Ah, madame, you recall something new? She pressed her hands together. I said I was asleep, but I did hear a noise, a faint one. I thought nothing of it at the time, so I dismissed it. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. And yet, now you remember. She avoided his gaze. I was frightened. Denning snorted. How convenient. Poirot lifted a hand. No, Monsieur Denning. Let us not judge too quickly. He turned back to Eleanor. And this noise, madame? What was it? She hesitated. It was like a chair being moved, and perhaps footsteps. Poirot nodded. And why did you not mention this before? Eleanor swallowed. Because if I did, I might have placed myself near the study, and I feared what that would mean. Fletcher crossed his arms. Because it would mean you were lying about your alibi. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. The air in the room grew heavier. The truth was shifting, and so were the lies. The next morning, a constable burst into the drawing room, his face pale. Sir, Langley is gone. Poirot's head lifted sharply. Gone? His room is empty. Bed untouched. No sign of him. Fletcher cursed under his breath. And just when things were getting interesting. Poirot reached for the folded note left behind on Langley's desk. He read it aloud. I was too late. The room fell silent. Poirot's fingers tightened around the paper. Ah, he whispered. So the pieces move again. Langley had disappeared. But was he running from danger or toward it? Chapter 4. The trap is set. Poirot sat across from Inspector Fletcher. A newspaper spread before them. The bold headline read, Murder at Winslow Manor. Killer confesses. Fletcher exhaled. This better work, Poirot. If the murderer thinks someone has confessed, they might panic. But it's a risk. Poirot smiled. Mais oui, mon ami. And a desperate man makes mistakes. The article, carefully crafted, suggested that a mysterious informant had come forward with undeniable proof of the murderer's identity. Poirot had ensured that just enough details of the crime were included to make the real killer uneasy. By morning, Poirot said, tapping the paper, our culprit will read this and feel the noose tightening. If they have left anything incriminating behind, any loose ends, they will seek to erase them before the confession is fully revealed. Fletcher nodded. And you think they'll return to the scene of the crime? Poirot's eyes gleamed. They will have no choice. The stage was set. The bait had been laid. Now all that remained was to watch and wait. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the rustling of wind through the trees. Inside Winslow Manor, Poirot sat quietly in the darkened study, listening. Then, a faint click. The unmistakable sound of a lock being tampered with. Poirot's lips curved. The fish had taken the bait. A shadow moved near the hidden safe, where Arthur Winslow's missing records had once been kept. Poirot remained still, observing. The intruder worked quickly, slipping gloved hands inside the compartment, searching. But for what? Poirot waited another moment before stepping forward. Bonsoir, mon ami. The figure froze. Then, in a sudden motion, they bolted for the door. Fletcher and his men sprang into action. Stop right there! The intruder hesitated for only a second before lunging toward the window. But before they could escape, Poirot's voice cut through the tension. "Monsieur Denning, you disappoint me." The figure stopped. Slowly, Charles Denning turned, his face cast in shadow. Fletcher strode forward, grabbing his arm. "Got you." Denning's chest rose and fell rapidly. "You don't understand." Poirot nodded. "Non, Monsieur Denning, I understand perfectly. And now you must tell us what you were looking for." Denning's gaze flickered toward the safe, and for the first time, Poirot saw something beyond fear in his eyes. Regret. Fletcher pushed Denning into the chair. "Breaking into a crime scene, tampering with evidence, this is looking very bad for you." Denning exhaled sharply. "I didn't kill him." Poirot regarded him with quiet amusement. "And yet, you returned to this place, to this safe, at this hour. Very curious, no?" Denning's jaw tightened. "I was looking for something. Something that could clear me." Fletcher scoffed. "Oh, that's a new one." Poirot raised a hand. "Let him speak." He turned to Denning. "What were you trying to find, monsieur?" Denning hesitated. "The ledger. I know it was altered. Winslow was investigating someone, and that someone wasn't me." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet, you were willing to risk everything to retrieve it?" Denning nodded. "Because if I didn't, the real murderer would make sure it disappeared forever." Poirot folded his arms. "Ah, then I suggest we look at this ledger very carefully." Denning swallowed. "If it's still there." Poirot's eyes darkened. The truth was drawing closer. But would it be enough? Poirot took the ledger from the safe, his fingers carefully flipping through its pages. Numbers, accounts, transactions, seemingly unremarkable at first glance. Then something caught his eye. A correction, subtle but telling. He pointed to the entry. "Here, Inspector, do you see?" Fletcher frowned. "The ink looks different. Like it was added later." Denning nodded. "That's what I was trying to prove. Winslow's records were doctored. Someone changed the figures after his death to cover their tracks." Poirot tapped the page. "And yet, my dear Denning, this was a clumsy alteration. The handwriting is slightly off, the ink not yet fully set. The real question is, who benefits from this change?" Fletcher flipped through the following pages. "The altered amounts, they funnel into an unlisted offshore account." Poirot's expression remained impassive. "Ah, and who controls this account?" Fletcher turned to the last page, where a signature lay scrawled. His eyes widened. "Eleanor Winslow." A silence fell over the room. Poirot exhaled. "Ah, the widow inherits, and the ledger disappears. How terribly convenient." Denning looked between them. "So you see, I wasn't the one Winslow was after." Poirot nodded. "No, Monsieur Denning. It appears that someone else had more to lose." And at last, the truth began to take shape. Poirot held up a small slip of paper between his fingers. "Ah, Monsieur Langley, it seems fate has been kind to you." Langley, weary from suspicion, frowned. "What is that?" Poirot examined the train ticket stub, its ink slightly faded but still legible. "A ticket from London to Manchester, dated 2 days before the murder." Fletcher peered over Poirot's shoulder. "That proves nothing. He could have returned in time to commit the crime." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Non, mon ami. The return journey is stamped as well. Langley was still in Manchester on the night of the murder." Denning scoffed. "And yet, he called the police first. That alone is suspicious." Poirot inclined his head. "Suspicious, oui, but not of murder. Langley was set up." Langley exhaled, his tension breaking at last. "Then why was I dragged into this at all?" Poirot turned the ticket between his fingers. "Because Mon cher monsieur, the real murderer needed a scapegoat. And you were the perfect one. Langley shook his head, his relief tempered by anger. Then who is it? Poirot smiled slightly. Patience, Monsieur Langley. We are nearly there. Inspector Fletcher placed the recovered revolver on the table, his expression grim. Ballistics confirmed it. It's the murder weapon. Poirot nodded. Mais oui. And now we must ask, where did it come from? Fletcher flipped open his notebook. We traced the serial number. It was purchased illegally 3 months ago. Denning leaned forward. 3 months. But that would mean, Poirot finished for him, that this crime was not one of passion, but of careful planning. His fingers drummed against the table. The killer did not seize an opportunity. They created one. Langley frowned. But if the murderer planned it so far in advance, why frame me? Poirot's eyes glinted. Ah, that is where the brilliance lies, mon ami. By involving you, an outsider, the true culprit, removed suspicion from themselves entirely. Eleanor Winslow shifted in her seat. And who exactly are you accusing? Poirot smiled, his voice soft but firm. Patience, madame. The moment of truth is upon us. A heavy silence settled over the room before Eleanor Winslow let out a slow breath. It was me. The words hung in the air. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. You confess? Eleanor lifted her chin. Yes, I killed Arthur. Poirot watched her intently. Ah, and why, madame? She hesitated. I couldn't bear his cruelty anymore. Poirot's head tilted slightly. A noble motive, non? And yet, your confession lacks one thing. Denning scoffed. What's that? Poirot's voice was calm. Conviction. Eleanor blinked. I told you, I did it. Poirot folded his hands. Non, madame, you are lying. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Poirot's gaze was unyielding. Your confession is rehearsed, false, and worse. It protects the true killer. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Poirot exhaled. Let us unravel the truth, once and for all. Poirot rose to his feet. It is clear to me now. The murder of Arthur Winslow was never about revenge, nor passion. It was about power. He turned to Denning. Monsieur, you were meant to discover fraud, not commit it. You were a distraction. Then to Eleanor. Madame, your role was to divert suspicion, not take the blame. His voice sharpened. And Langley, you were the pawn, carefully placed on the board. Poirot exhaled. The real murderer built this deception from the very beginning. Silence. Poirot's moustache twitched. And now, it is time to bring the game to an end. Poirot stepped toward the fireplace, his gaze sweeping across the assembled suspects. You have all played your parts well, he said softly. But now, we shall see who played their hand too well. He gestured to the butler. Monsieur Harris, see that no one leaves. Fletcher exchanged a glance with Poirot. You're ready to name them? Poirot nodded. Oui, the evidence is complete. The lies have crumbled. His gaze settled on one person in the room. And the murderer, mes amis, is sitting among us. A sharp intake of breath. Poirot smiled. Let us begin. Chapter 5. The Reveal. A Murder Planned Twice. The atmosphere in the drawing room was thick with tension. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the faces of those gathered. Poirot stood at the centre, his small frame poised with purpose, his keen eyes sweeping across the room. Eleanor Winslow sat stiffly in her chair, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Charles Denning leaned against the fireplace, his expression guarded. Richard Langley, still shaken from being framed, stared at Poirot with a mix of apprehension and hope. Inspector Fletcher stood nearby, arms crossed, waiting for the moment when the famed detective would finally speak. Poirot clasped his hands together. "Mes amis, we have arrived at the end. The pieces of our puzzle, so carefully scattered, now fall into place." No one spoke. They only waited. Poirot took a slow step forward. There were many false trails, many deceits woven into this crime. But in the end, there is only one truth. And that truth, mes amis, is this. His voice dropped, deliberate and measured. Arthur Winslow was never meant to be found when he was. Eleanor flinched. Denning inhaled sharply. Langley frowned. Poirot continued, his voice cutting through the stillness. This was a murder of precision, a murder that was planned twice, and now we shall see how it was done. The drawing room held its breath. Poirot turned toward Eleanor. "Madame Winslow, you told us you heard nothing the night your husband died." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "That is correct." Poirot nodded. "And yet he was already dead before anyone else entered that study." A murmur rippled through the room. Fletcher frowned. "But Langley found the body at 11. The doctor confirmed the time of death." Poirot raised a finger. "Ah, but you assume, mon ami, that what we saw was the truth. It was not. The body was cold, yes, but the signs of death were carefully manipulated." Denning scoffed. "How is that possible?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A trick, Monsieur Denning. The gunshot wound was staged. The real cause of death happened much earlier, likely in the late afternoon. Arthur Winslow was poisoned first. His body left in the study." Eleanor let out a sharp breath. Poirot continued. "The killer then returned later, after rigor mortis had set in, to fire a shot into a lifeless body. A clever ruse to mislead the time of death." Fletcher swore under his breath. "So Winslow was dead for hours before Langley even saw him." "Exactement." Poirot smiled faintly. "A murder before the murder?" Langley exhaled. "Then the entire night was a set-up?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. And mon ami, you were at the centre of it." Langley tensed. I don't understand." Poirot's gaze was unwavering. "You called the police, did you not?" Langley nodded. "Yes. When I saw the body—" He stopped abruptly, realization dawning. Poirot spread his hands. "But how did you know it was murder?" A hush fell over the room. Poirot took a step forward. When a man discovers a body, his first instinct is to check if the person is alive. He may call for help, shake the victim, even cry out in alarm. But you, Monsieur Langley, you called the police immediately. Langley's face paled. I just knew something was wrong." Poirot shook his head. "No, mon ami, you assumed murder because the killer wanted you to." Fletcher exhaled sharply. "They set him up." "Exactement." Poirot nodded. Langley was meant to discover the body at precisely the right moment. He was meant to react exactly as he did. Langley whispered, "So the real murderer counted on my panic." "Mais oui. They needed someone to raise the alarm to make it look like the crime had just occurred." Poirot's gaze darkened. "And they needed you to be the first suspect." Langley swallowed hard. "Then, who?" Poirot turned slowly. His next words sent a chill through the room. "The one who orchestrated this performance." Poirot gestured toward the evidence table. "Every detail of this crime was crafted with precision. Consider the stolen watch, the burned telegram, the staged gunshot." Fletcher nodded. "Go on." Poirot pointed to the missing watch. "A classic trick, no? The illusion of a robbery gone wrong. But what thief takes a watch and leaves a safe full of valuable documents?" Denning frowned. "Then why take it?" "To mislead us, just like the telegram found in Winslow's hand." Poirot lifted the half-burned paper. It warned him of danger, But why burn part of it? Because the true sender's name was on the missing portion. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Then Winslow knew who was after him. We. Poirot's voice was grim, but the most telling clue, the gunshot. Fletcher frowned. What about it? Poirot clasped his hands. A single bullet, fired into a corpse hours after the real murder, a deception to throw off the time of death. Denning's eyes narrowed. And the murderer went through all that effort to frame Langley? Poirot nodded. Oui, mais plus que ça. He turned, his gaze locking onto one person in the room. And now, the final act begins. A hush fell. Poirot inhaled deeply. The killer is among us, and soon, mes amis, they shall have nowhere left to hide. Poirot turned, his sharp eyes settling on Eleanor Winslow. And now, madame, it is time for the curtain to fall. Eleanor stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but you do. You see, from the very beginning, this crime had the careful touch of a woman's hand, subtle, deliberate, and meticulously designed. Denning frowned. Eleanor, that's absurd. Poirot gestured to the ledger. The false financial records. They were not altered to frame someone. No, they were altered to protect the true culprit. Madame Winslow, you were the one who stood to lose the most if Winslow exposed the fraud. It was your name on the hidden account. Eleanor's expression did not waver. Arthur handled the finances. I had nothing to do with it. Poirot shook his head. Non, madame. Arthur discovered what you had done. He changed his will. He confronted you. And that was when you decided. He had to die. Langley exhaled. But why frame me? Poirot's voice was gentle. Because you, mon ami, were convenient. You panicked. You called the police. And that was exactly what she wanted. It gave her the perfect cover. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the arms of her chair. You have no proof. Poirot's moustache twitched. Ah, madame, but we do. You see, every deception leaves a loose thread. And yours was the telegram. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. Poirot had seen what he needed. The truth was out. Poirot sighed. You were not only motivated by greed, madame. No, your motive was far more layered. He turned to the others. Arthur Winslow was a difficult man, yes? Controlling, ruthless. His enemies were many. Denning scoffed. That's putting it lightly. Poirot nodded. And yet, Madame Winslow, you were not simply a woman desperate for freedom. You were a woman in love. A silence fell. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Poirot saw her throat tighten slightly. Poirot continued. Arthur had uncovered fraud, yes. But more importantly, he had uncovered your affair. Denning's head jerked up. Affair? Poirot smiled sadly. Oui, Monsieur Denning. Eleanor could not have done this alone. She needed help. An accomplice, someone to move unnoticed, to ensure the staged crime unfolded perfectly. And who better than the man she trusted most? He turned to Denning. You, monsieur. A hush. Denning swallowed. That's insane. Poirot sighed. Is it? You altered the ledger for her. You provided the gun. But in the end, she did not need you. She needed a scapegoat. Eleanor exhaled. I would like a lawyer. Poirot inclined his head. Mais oui. But madame, even the finest lawyer cannot erase the truth. Fletcher stepped forward. Eleanor Winslow, you're under arrest for the murder of your husband. As the cuffs clicked shut, Poirot's gaze darkened. And yet, the danger is not over. Fletcher frowned. What do you mean? Poirot's expression was grave, because another murder was about to take place. Eleanor's arrest should have been the end, but Poirot remained unmoving, his expression troubled. Denning shook his head. It's over, isn't it? Poirot turned slowly. Not quite, mon ami. There was another plan in motion. Langley's face twisted in confusion. Another? Poirot exhaled. Oui, someone else, someone we have overlooked, was planning another murder. Fletcher frowned. Who? Poirot turned to Eleanor. You planned Arthur's death, oui, but you were not the only one with something to hide. You believed you were in control. But madame, you were mistaken. Eleanor's lips parted slightly. For the first time, Poirot saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear. Poirot's voice dropped. Langley, you were next. Langley paled. Me? But why? Poirot's voice was grim. Because you were the only loose end. The butler, Harris, took a slow step backward. Poirot's gaze snapped to him. And there it is, he murmured. Monsieur Harris, you were not simply a servant, were you? Harris's face darkened. You talk too much, Poirot. A movement, a flash of something metallic, before Fletcher seized him, forcing him against the wall. A knife clattered to the floor. Poirot exhaled. Ah, and there we have it. Langley's breath came quick. He was going to… Oui, Poirot nodded. A second murder was in motion, but as always… He straightened his cuffs. Poirot was ahead. The ordeal was over. Eleanor and Harris were taken away, the crime finally laid bare. But as Poirot stood near the window, Hastings, who had been silent through much of the affair, stepped forward. You don't look satisfied, Poirot. Poirot did not turn. Do I not, mon ami? Hastings shifted. You solved the case. The guilty parties have been arrested. And yet, something still bothers you. Poirot was silent for a moment. Then softly he said, there was another hand in this game. Someone who moved the pieces so carefully, yet never dirtied their hands. Hastings frowned. You mean, there was someone else? Poirot smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Perhaps, mon ami, or perhaps the true mastermind is still out there. Hastings shivered. Poirot's gaze remained on the horizon. The game, he murmured, is never truly over. The storm had long passed, but the weight of the night still lingered. Poirot turned to Hastings, his voice quiet but resolute. One must never grow complacent, mon ami. Murder is not always what it seems. Hastings frowned. You mean… Poirot smiled, his moustache twitching. The solution, Hastings, is only as complete as the questions we dare to ask. Hastings exhaled. So you think this isn't over? Poirot's gaze darkened. Non. It never is. As they walked away, the fire in the hearth burned lower, and somewhere, perhaps far away, perhaps closer than they thought, a new mystery was already unfolding. For Hercule Poirot's work was never done. Thank you for tuning in to Mind Sherlock. If you enjoyed this mind-bending mystery, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more thrilling detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories flowing and the mysteries unraveling. We'd love to hear your thoughts. How did you find this story? If you have any suggestions or theories, feel free to share them in the comments below. Your input keeps the mystery alive.